Author Kresser, who believes in paleo diets, says that according to studies, eating dietary cholesterol does not lead to higher rates of blood cholesterol in most cases. And even if eating saturated fat and dietary cholesterol does lead to higher saturated fat rates or blood cholesterol, it still doesn't correlate to higher death rates. Do you agree with this? Why or why not?
You know, I'm going to start out with saying I have tremendous respect for Chris Kresser. I think he is one of the sanest voices in the paleo world. I think he has, he's very astute, and he looks at research very carefully. So I really do, I do have a lot of respect for him. However, I think he's wrong on that one. And I think he's wrong for this reason. We have many decades of solid research that shows saturated fat increases blood cholesterol levels, and particularly LDL cholesterol, which increases your risk of heart disease. The studies are strong and consistent. In our, the American Heart Association and American College of Cardiology's guideline reports, they suggest saturated fat be limited to 5 to 6%. And the level of evidence is the highest grade of evidence that exists. I think it's really quite indisputable. Now, the study that most people are quoting to suggest that we don't have to worry about saturated fat is the Chowdhury trial that came out in 2014. And the Chowdhury trial was so riddled with errors and omissions that Walter Willett, who's probably the most quoted nutrition expert on the planet, made a very strong statement that people need to discard the findings, essentially. And just to give you some examples of the issues in that study, I think there were really two big. Well, one big issue is in many cases the studies that were included in the meta-analysis were controlled for cholesterol. So you can't control, when you're looking at saturated fat, you can't control for the thing that saturated fat increases, which increases risk of, you can't control for a variable that's on that chain of what causes the disease. It doesn't make sense. And so that was one thing. And then the other thing I think that is really important to mention is 19 out of the 20 studies were looking at sort of comparing within populations. So comparing, say in the United States, people eating 11% saturated fat versus those eating 12 or 13 or 14. Then they were looking at the Japanese, some of whom were eating 5% saturated fat, some eating 6 or 7%. They didn't see big differences because the amount of saturated fat was so, the differences in the consumption were so small. There was one study included that actually looked at huge differences in saturated fat intake within the population they were studying. That was Epic Oxford. Of course, the meat eaters were eating much more, the vegans eating much less. The vegans who were eating the lowest amounts, which I think were around 5 or 6%, about half the saturated fat of the meat eaters, actually had 2.77 times less, lower rates of disease than the highest saturated fat eaters. Then the other thing that's really interesting is if you compared the population that had the highest intake of saturated fat, which were I believe the people from Finland, they actually had a 4.4 times higher rate of heart disease than the people eating the lowest in Japan. But they didn't do those cross-cultural comparisons at all. And so, the other thing that I think is interesting about that study is that when the study was first done, they actually did show an increased risk with higher saturated fat intakes, and the study was rejected originally from the first publication they went to, and then they actually reworked the data a little bit and got something different before it was actually published. And so I think there are some things that people need to understand, that sometimes the headlines And the headlines were huge after that study came out. Butter is back, saturated fat vindicated. All of these headlines came, and people came away thinking, wow, saturated fat's been vindicated. And in fact, that study vindicated nothing. As a matter of fact, I actually spoke via email with one of the co-authors of that study, who said to me very clearly in an email, this study does not show saturated fat has been vindicated. She said nothing that has been said for several decades about saturated fat has changed because of this study. Saturated fat increases LDL, increased LDL increases risk of heart disease, period. And so I think that's very important to know. And then the other thing to know is the American Heart Association put together a panel of the leading experts on diet and heart disease, and it was, I actually spoke to one of the lead authors of this report. It was the most comprehensive report I've seen. It was called the Presidential Report, 2017, and they went through all of the research, and they were very, very clear about a saturated fat. And I'll tell you what the message is. The message is this: if you replace saturated fat with refined carbohydrates, you will not reduce your risk of coronary heart disease. It's a wash. They're both bad. And so that was the new information that we got from these studies. However, if you replace saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, you reduce your risk about 25%. If you replace saturated fat with monounsaturated fat, you reduce your risk about 15%. If you replace saturated fat with whole grains, you reduce your risk about 9%. And to be honest, in my opinion, that would be much higher if the whole grains they were choosing were truly whole grains as they're picked off the plant, not flour turned into whole wheat bread. I think we would see very different results. So I think we need to be, we really need to be cautious about this, put butter in your coffee and, cook with all sorts of oil and pour it on your foods. This is not a good plan, and it will backfire. So people need to be very careful about this.